Let's get the latest from NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor, and also with us, senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker, and former advisor to Speaker John Boehner, Maura Gillespie. Sahil, break down this news we just learned that could scramble this debate for Republicans.
Yeah, Anna, this is a significant setback for Senate Republicans and President Trump's one big beautiful bill. The parliamentarian, which is the Senate's in-house referee, has disqualified a bunch of provisions from this piece of legislation, provisions that could total as much as several $100 billion in savings. These provisions that have now been ruled ineligible for this process include Medicaid cuts and eligibility restrictions on the basis of immigration status. It includes federal money to states based on how they run their eligibility process. It includes reimbursement rules for PBMs. And this is a big one, changes to Medicaid provider taxes, which is the major source of savings that Republicans have been eyeing in this bill. That is now knocked out. Another provision that has been removed, a funding restriction under the Affordable Care Act. If you add it up, there are a ton of savings here that have now been tossed out of this bill. Senate Republicans are going to try to reword some of these provisions to ensure that they comply with the rules, but it's not really clear how many of them they can cure. The Republican sources I've talked to this morning say this is not fatal to the bill. They remain optimistic they can get it done. They're going to try to adjust the language on some provisions. The one they're most worried about is the Medicaid provider tax because that gave them the biggest source of savings here. Now, Anna, they were hoping to start voting on this bill tomorrow. That has been thrown into further doubt because the bill clearly isn't ready for prime time as is.
And Sahil, just for perspective here, this isn't the first time the parliamentarian has ruled against an administration's wishes. We saw this happen with President Biden and the Democrats, too, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We saw several of President Biden and Democratic priorities in 2021 and 2022 get knocked out of their reconciliation bills by the parliamentarian. That includes a minimum wage increase. Remember Senator Kyrsten Sinema's famous thumbs down on the floor? That's what that was about. It also includes Democrats trying at the time to legalize the Dreamer population through the reconciliation process. That was ruled ineligible by the parliamentarian. So she has been fair in terms of saying immigration policy changes that either party is trying to do in reconciliation are not valid.
So, Maura, this whole issue with the parliamentarian aren't the only issues that Republicans have been grappling with. There's still the state and local tax deductions, also known as SALT, the rural hospital funding issues, deficit reduction issues. So if you are the Speaker or Senator Thune right now, how worried are you?
Well, you know, Senator Thune has already said that some Republicans in the Senate are coming around to the fact that the SALT tax needs to be dealt with, and they have to come around to the fact that that's something that is a non-negotiable for House Republicans to get this bill across the finish line. So there is some concessions being made as far as within the fractures that the Republican Party is facing. But you mentioned rural hospitals. I mean, that's a big issue for a lot of members. SNAP cuts is also a big issue for a lot of Republican members, as well as the Medicaid issues. And so John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, has just said that he is not planning to delay anything yet, but that these cuts, he's not going to push back at the parliamentarian because he knows that it goes both ways, right? You can't just cherry pick when you decide that the parliamentarian serves a purpose. And so I think that the Senate Majority Leader knows that. But it's this self-imposed deadline is really their own making. They don't need to push it this weekend, but we'll see what happens in that regard.
And so thus, as you point out, if they don't do it before this weekend, it's not like there are some kind of major consequence, although they might face the wrath of the president. Right. That would be the consequence for the party. Multiple provisions concerning Medicaid funding, as we mentioned, David, were struck down. The other issue with that is they were key in paying for Trump's tax cuts. So if the GOP can't get funds from there, where do they turn?
Yeah, really good question. I think one thing to understand is, except for a few budget hawks, nobody really cares about whether or not you're able to pay for this. They don't care about the deficit consequences. They're interested in the pro-growth tax cut aspect of this. That's how they look at taxes, as very pro-growth and stimulative to the economy. They also look at this just politically as how they're going to deliver most of their 2024 campaign promises, because there's not much else they're going to do between now and the midterm elections, at least not really of consequence when you look at the border provisions and the tax and spending provisions that are rolled up into this reconciliation package. So I don't think it's the deadline that's that important because they do have plenty of wiggle room here. I'd look at the August recess as more of a deadline. But Sahil, knows this. Moore knows this. If you don't give these guys false deadlines, they don't feel any sense of urgency to get anything done. And I think that's why they've been pushing for this July 4th thing to happen. And look, never underestimate a politician's ability to explain how the policy they opposed is not actually the policy they're opposing, and therefore they found a way to support it.
I get what you're saying there, David. Well done. Sahil, we've heard from Congressman Greg Steube now calling on the vice president to overrule the parliamentarian. That's something Senator Thune has vowed he would not do, but he could fire her, something Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville is now calling for. Is that something you could see him doing?
There is no indication at this time, Anna, that Senate Republicans are considering either overruling the parliamentarian or firing the parliamentarian. This gets dangerously close to nuking the filibuster, which both parties have been poking holes in for quite a long time. Remember, they're using this process to get around the filibuster, and the more you stretch it, the more you try to disregard or try to get around some of the rules that limit what you can do in the filibuster-proof process, the more you have to answer the question, why do you want the 60-vote threshold to begin with? So Senate Majority Leader John Thune has promised to protect that 60-vote threshold, but it is a tradition among members of the House to start throwing grenades over at the Senate, so to speak, to try to get them to overcome the 60-vote threshold. It's very common, I think, to see these frustrations play out in the reconciliation process.
So maybe common, but more bottom line, what do Republicans do? What are they going to do?
They need to do a better job of messaging. I'd say that just first and foremost, because if we push this to the August recess, they go home to their constituents and they have to explain why it is that they wanted to get this done right now, why they made the cuts that they made, because regardless, any bill that comes across Congress is not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect legislation, especially when it comes to our finances. So sacrifices have to be made, cuts will be made, but it's a matter of messaging to your constituents directly. And I think that that's going to be the biggest task ahead of them, is to be unified in, okay, we had to make some sacrifices, but we want to get this done. XYZ, here's why. But I do think that some of these things that the parliamentarian has shot down are for the best. You know, Senator Mike Lee had this provision about selling public lands. I think that she shot that down, and I'm glad that she did. You know, I think there are some things that just have gone too far. And so it's important to have this kind of a barometer to say, okay, no, that doesn't really fall into this bill. Just like you mentioned, that some of those provisions under President Biden were also pushed back on. And it's important to have that kind of third-party check there. So for the House to be saying, abolish it, get rid of it, I know Rep. Bandrew from New Jersey also said to get rid of it. That just shows me that they don't understand why we have systems in place that we do.
And David, President Trump is still set to hold a big, beautiful bill event today at the White House. What sort of pressure do you imagine he's putting on Republicans? Reminder, he wants this done next week.
Yeah, look, he's putting the screws to them, but I think that it's working in this regard. You know, this party, unlike the 2017 tax bill, where it helped that he largely stayed out of the negotiations and delegated to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and others, this time around, he's really essential. And that's why John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, is working so closely with him. Let Trump be the one to explain to people why this needs to get done one way or the other. Because Republican voters, at the end of the day, they trust Donald Trump a lot more than they trust congressional Republicans. And if he wants this done, and there's going to be political uncertainty regardless, given some of these provisions, are the Medicaid cuts going to hurt people? Are people going to think that the tax cuts were for them versus, you know, other people? If Trump gives this his seal of approval, at least congressional Republicans, from a purely political standpoint, can say, listen, Trump campaigned on this, Trump believed in this, and we are with him, even if we have some doubts. That's a much better place for them to be. Trump won't be on the ballot next year, and you do not want a depressed Republican base who just says, there's really no point in me showing up.